Welcome back. This is one of the most uncomfortable moments in live television history. In 1972, a TV host looked Bumpy Johnson's widow straight in the eye and called her late husband a rat on camera. What happened next was so tense that just 30 seconds later, the broadcast was cut. Today, we're breaking down exactly what led to that moment, what was said, and why it shocked everyone watching. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because every video here is built on deep research, verified sources, and real historical data that takes serious time to uncover. Bumpy Johnson, born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in 1905, was far more than the simplified labels often attached to his name. To many, he was a feared Harlem crime boss. To others, he was a neighborhood protector and benefactor. His nickname, Bumpy, came from a noticeable bump on the back of his head, but his reputation grew from his intelligence, discipline, and ability to navigate both the streets and elite social circles. Unlike many gangsters of his era, Bumpy was known to read Shakespeare, write poetry, and carry himself with a calm, almost regal demeanor that set him apart. Growing up in South Carolina, Johnson was exposed early to racial violence, including the lynching of his older brother. Trauma played a significant role in shaping his worldview and hardened his distrust of authority. When he moved to Harlem as a teenager during the Harlem Renaissance, he found a community alive with culture, ambition, and opportunity, also exploitation. Johnson quickly learned that power in Harlem wasn't just about muscle, it was about alliances, strategy, and control over numbers gambling, which was the backbone of the local underground economy. Bumpy Johnson rose to prominence through his partnership with Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen, who ran a massive numbers operation and fought fiercely against Italian mob encroachment. Johnson became her top enforcer and strategist, gaining a reputation for being ruthless when necessary, but measured in his actions. This relationship gave him a front row seat to organized crime politics and taught him how power truly functioned behind the scenes. When Claire was eventually pushed out, Johnson didn't disappear, he adapted. His most controversial relationship was with Italian mob boss Vincent Chin, Gigante, and the Genovese crime family. Rather than being crushed by the mafia, Johnson negotiated a deal that allowed him to run Harlem's operations while paying a percentage to the Italians. This arrangement was unusual for the time and demonstrated Johnson's leverage and influence. To many in Harlem, this wasn't seen as selling out, it was seen as survival in a system designed to exclude black power entirely. Despite his criminal activities, Johnson was widely respected within the Harlem community. He was known to pay rent for struggling families, fund education for local children, and ensure that people who lived under his influence were protected from random violence and outside exploitation. Store owners, residents, and even some local leaders viewed him as a stabilizing force. This dual image, crime boss and community guardian, made him a complicated and deeply polarizing figure. Johnson also spent nearly half of his adult life in prison, yet incarceration only seemed to strengthen his legend. He maintained connections, studied law, and returned to Harlem each time with his influence largely intact. Law enforcement viewed him as intelligent, cautious, and difficult to pin down, which only added to his mystique. Rumors of him cooperating with authorities circulated for years. No definitive public proof ever surfaced during his lifetime. By the time of his death in 1968, Bumpy Johnson had become a symbol, depending on who was telling the story. To the government and media, he was a notorious criminal. To many in Harlem, he was a man who operated within a corrupt system and carved out power where none was meant to exist. Understanding who Bumpy Johnson really was requires holding all of these truths at once, which is exactly why calling him a rat years later would spark such outrage and tension on live television. Bumpy Johnson's influence on Harlem extended far beyond illegal operations and street power. It was deeply woven into the daily lives of the people who lived there. At a time when Harlem faced systemic neglect, poverty, and aggressive policing, Johnson emerged as a figure who understood the community's struggles from the inside. Many residents saw him not as an outsider imposing control, as someone who belonged to Harlem and operated by an unspoken code that prioritized local stability over chaos. One of the clearest ways his influence was felt was through the underground economy. The numbers racket, while illegal, provided jobs and income for countless Harlem residents who were shut out of legitimate employment due to racial discrimination. Writers, runners, collectors, and clerks all relied on this system to survive. Under Johnson's leadership, the operation was structured, predictable, relatively disciplined, which meant fewer street-level conflicts and more consistent income for those involved. Johnson was also known for stepping in where institutions failed. He paid rent for families facing eviction, helped people cover medical bills, and quietly funded education for promising students. These acts were rarely publicized, but they built loyalty and respect. In a neighborhood where banks, city officials, and social services often turned their backs, Johnson's financial help felt immediate and personal, reinforcing his role as an unofficial safety net. His presence also acted as a form of protection for Harlem businesses and residents. Petty criminals and outsiders knew that reckless violence or exploitation could bring consequences. While this control was rooted in fear, it also reduced random crime in certain areas. Store owners and local figures often felt safer knowing that disputes could be settled through Johnson's network rather than escalating into bloodshed. Culturally, Bumpy Johnson became part of Harlem's identity. He moved comfortably among artists, musicians, politicians, everyday working people. During and after the Harlem Renaissance, the neighborhood was a center of Black expression and pride, and Johnson embodied a version of Black power that existed outside traditional systems. He dressed sharply, spoke thoughtfully, and carried himself with dignity, reinforcing an image of authority that challenged stereotypes imposed by mainstream media. Johnson's influence also shaped how Harlem interacted with outside forces, particularly the mafia and law enforcement. Negotiating power, sharing arrangements rather than allowing violent takeovers, he ensured that Harlem retained a degree of autonomy. While these deals were controversial, many locals believed they prevented worse outcomes: total domination by outside crime families with no loyalty to the community. Even after his death, Johnson's impact on Harlem did not fade. Stories about him were passed down through generations, blending fact, myth, and legend. To some, he represented resistance and self-determination. To others, a morally complex figure who thrived in a broken system. What is undeniable is that Bumpy Johnson left a lasting imprint on Harlem's social, economic, and cultural fabric, an influence that made any public attack on his name deeply personal to those who remembered what he meant to the neighborhood. Bumpy Johnson's relationship with law enforcement was one of the most complex and misunderstood aspects of his life. From the outside, he was seen as a constant target of police surveillance, arrests, and prosecutions, yet he was rarely taken down permanently. Authorities viewed him as intelligent, disciplined, and unusually cautious, which made him difficult to trap. Unlike many street-level figures, Johnson avoided reckless behavior, limited who had access to him, and carefully managed information, traits that frustrated investigators for decades. Throughout his career, Johnson was arrested numerous times and spent nearly half of his adult life in prison. However, even incarceration did not sever his influence. Law enforcement officials were aware that Johnson continued to exert control through intermediaries, and each time he returned to Harlem, his position remained largely intact. This pattern led many detectives to suspect that Johnson either had extraordinary loyalty from his associates or possessed a deep understanding of how to operate just within the limits of provable criminal activity. Rumors of Johnson cooperating with police began circulating early, fueled largely by his ability to survive while others fell. In the criminal underworld, longevity often bred suspicion, and rivals found it easier to accuse him of being an informant than to accept his strategic brilliance. These rumors intensified whenever Johnson avoided long sentences or appeared to navigate conflicts without violent escalation. However, no public court records or verified testimony ever confirmed that he formally informed on his own organization. Johnson's interactions with law enforcement were not always hostile. He understood the power dynamics at play and often treated police with a calm, almost diplomatic demeanor. He reportedly believed that open confrontation with authorities was counterproductive and preferred to let lawyers and legal maneuvering do the work. This approach made him appear cooperative on the surface, even when he was actively protecting his operations behind the scenes. At the same time, Johnson was known to have a deep distrust of the justice system, rooted in personal and historical trauma. The lynching of his brother in the South left a permanent mark on his view of white authority and law enforcement. This history makes the idea of him willingly betraying his own people to police deeply controversial, particularly to those who knew him personally or lived under his influence in Harlem. Law enforcement agencies themselves were divided in their assessment of Johnson. Some saw him as a criminal mastermind who deserved harsher punishment, while others quietly acknowledged that his presence reduced chaos and violence in certain areas. Internal reports often described him as manageable compared to less disciplined figures. This uneasy tolerance further fueled speculation that Johnson had some form of understanding with authorities, even if no formal cooperation existed. By the time of his death, the question of whether Bumpy Johnson was a rat remained unresolved and deeply polarizing. for his supporters, the accusation was an insult with no proof, ignoring years of prison time and personal sacrifice. For critics, his survival was suspicious enough to justify doubt. This unresolved tension between perception and evidence is exactly what made the 1972 accusation so explosive, especially when delivered directly to his widow on live television. The media climate of the early 1970s was defined by confrontation, controversy, and a growing appetite for shock value. Television was no longer just a place for polite conversation and controlled narratives. It had become a battleground for uncomfortable truths, heated opinions, and public spectacle. Talk shows and interview programs increasingly pushed boundaries, knowing that tension and conflict kept viewers watching. This shift created an environment where hosts felt empowered to provoke guests in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. Journalistic standards were also in transition during this period. While investigative reporting was gaining credibility after events like the Pentagon Papers and the Watergate scandal, entertainment-driven programming often blurred the line between fact and accusation. Allegations were sometimes presented as discussion points rather than verified claims, leaving guests to defend themselves in real time. For figures connected to crime or controversy, television could quickly become a hostile arena rather than a neutral platform. Crime-related stories, especially those involving organized crime, drew massive public interest in the 1970s. Films, books, and news coverage romanticized gangsters while simultaneously condemning them, creating a contradictory public obsession. Black crime figures, however, were often portrayed with less nuance and more suspicion than their white counterparts. This racial imbalance shaped how audiences perceived figures like Bumpy Johnson and made it easier for media personalities to level serious accusations without offering equal context. Television added another layer of risk. Unlike pre-recorded programs, live broadcasts left little room for correction or reconsideration. Hosts could ask inflammatory questions, and once spoken, those words could not be taken back. Producers often relied on the shock itself to drive ratings, assuming any fallout could be managed after the fact. This gamble frequently placed guests, especially those unprepared for confrontation, into emotionally volatile situations. Women, particularly widows of controversial men, were often treated unfairly by the media during this era. Rather than being approached with sensitivity, they were sometimes used as stand-ins for their husbands' legacies and forced to answer for actions they did not commit. Inviting Bumpy Johnson's widow onto television in 1972 was already a delicate decision, and the confrontational tone that followed reflected a broader pattern of media insensitivity. The power imbalance between hosts and guests was significant. Hosts controlled the questions, the pacing, and ultimately the narrative presented to viewers. Guests who pushed back risked being framed as defensive or evasive. This dynamic made it easier for a host to introduce an accusation like calling someone a rat, and harder for the guest to meaningfully respond without appearing emotional or unstable. In this climate, the incident involving Bumpy Johnson's widow was not an isolated lapse in judgment, but a product of the era itself. The pursuit of dramatic television overshadowed responsibility, accuracy, and empathy. When the accusation crossed a line and the tension became unmanageable, the sudden cut of the broadcast reflected a system realizing, too late, that it had gone further than even 1970s television was prepared to handle. The TV host at the center of the 1972 incident was known for a sharp, confrontational interviewing style that thrived on putting guests on the defensive, unlike traditional interviewers who guided conversations gently. This host believed in provoking emotional reactions to reveal what he considered the truth. His programs were designed to be unpredictable. Unpredictability became a major draw for viewers during an era when television was increasingly competitive. By the early 1970s, the host had built a reputation for tackling controversial topics head-on, including crime, politics, and social unrest. He often invited guests connected to sensitive issues, fully aware that discomfort and tension would boost ratings. While some praised him as fearless and honest, others criticized him for being reckless and insensitive, especially when dealing with people who were not seasoned public speakers. The host's approach reflected the broader cultural mood of the time. America was grappling with distrust in institutions, rising crime rates, deep racial divisions. In that environment, aggressive questioning was often framed as holding people accountable, even when accusations were based on rumor rather than verified fact. This mindset allowed television personalities to blur the line between investigation and provocation. Despite his confidence on camera, the host was not a legal expert or historian. Much of what he presented during interviews came from secondhand sources, law enforcement rumors, or popular narratives circulating in the press. In the case of Bumpy Johnson, these narratives were especially murky, filled with speculation about cooperation with authorities, but lacking hard evidence. Presenting such claims as fact carried serious ethical risks. Inviting Bumpy Johnson's widow onto the show placed the host in a position of responsibility he failed to fully honor. Rather than treating her as an individual with her own perspective and grief, he approached the interview as an opportunity to challenge her husband's legacy. This decision reflected a calculated risk. The emotional weight of confronting a widow could either create a powerful moment or spiral into public backlash. When the host directly called Bumpy Johnson a rat, it marked a turning point in the interview. Even by the standards of confrontational television, the accusation crossed into personal attack. The atmosphere reportedly shifted instantly, with visible discomfort in the studio and an audible tension that suggested producers realized the situation was slipping out of control. The host's role in the incident ultimately became a case study in the limits of provocative television. While his style thrived on controversy, the abrupt cut of the broadcast suggested that there were boundaries he had not anticipated crossing. In retrospect, the moment exposed how easily the pursuit of dramatic television could override ethics, empathy, and respect, especially when dealing with unresolved legacies and living family members. The 1972 broadcast took place in a television studio designed for live discussion, with a setting meant to feel intimate yet authoritative. The host sat across from Bumpy Johnson's widow in a simple interview layout, creating the impression of a serious conversation rather than an entertainment. Studio lighting was bright and unforgiving, leaving little room for emotional concealment, while cameras were positioned to capture close facial expressions, a common technique used to heighten tension during interviews. The audience, whether in studio or watching from home, was primed for a compelling discussion. Promotional material leading up to the broadcast suggested an in-depth look at Bumpy Johnson's life and legacy, drawing viewers interested in organized crime and Harlem history. Many expected reflection, insight, or personal anecdotes, confrontation. This mismatch between expectation and reality played a significant role in why the moment felt so jarring. Television in 1972 operated with limited delay mechanisms. Unlike modern broadcasts, there was little ability to censor or edit remarks in real time. Producers relied heavily on the host's judgment to maintain control of the conversation. Once a line was crossed, damage control options were minimal, which raised the stakes for everyone involved in the production. Bumpy Johnson's widow entered the studio under emotional strain. She was representing not only her late husband, but also her family and, indirectly, the Harlem community that still respected him. Sitting under studio lights, facing pointed questions, she carried the weight of public scrutiny in a space where she had limited power to shape the narrative. As the interview progressed, the mood reportedly shifted from reflective to tense. Body language became more guarded, pauses grew longer, and the energy in the room changed noticeably. Crew members later described a sense that the conversation was veering into dangerous territory, with the host pressing harder and the guest visibly reacting to the tone. The accusation that followed did not occur in isolation. It was the culmination of escalating tension. When the host used the word rat, it landed heavily in the confined studio space. Gasps, silence, and sudden stillness replaced the flow of conversation, making the moment feel even more explosive to those present. Within seconds, producers made the decision to cut the broadcast. Whether the cut was due to fear of escalation, legal concerns, or concern for the guest's well-being, the abrupt ending signaled that the situation had exceeded acceptable limits. The setting that was meant to host a serious discussion instead became the backdrop for one of the most uncomfortable live TV moments of the era. The accusation that Bumpy Johnson was a rat did not come out of nowhere. It was rooted in years of rumors, speculation, and misunderstanding surrounding his survival in a violent criminal world. In organized crime culture, longevity itself often breeds suspicion. Many of Johnson's contemporaries were killed, imprisoned for life, or dismantled by law enforcement, while he repeatedly returned to Harlem after prison with his influence intact. To outsiders, especially those unfamiliar with his methods, this seemed impossible without cooperation. One major source of the rumor was Johnson's working arrangement with the Italian mafia, particularly the Genovese crime family. To some, this partnership looked like submission or betrayal rather than negotiation. Critics argued that no black crime figure could maintain such an agreement without giving something valuable in return. While money and territorial control were the obvious terms, skeptics leapt to the conclusion that information must have been part of the deal, even though no evidence ever publicly supported that claim. Law enforcement narratives also played a role. Over the years, Unnamed police sources occasionally suggested that Johnson was more intelligent than most, or different from the others, phrases that were sometimes interpreted as coded language for cooperation. Media outlets repeated these suggestions without documentation, allowing rumor to harden into perceived fact. By the time of the 1972 broadcast, the idea that Johnson had informed on others had circulated so long that some treated it as truth. Johnson's repeated prison releases further fueled the accusation. Each time he avoided a life sentence or returned sooner than expected, speculation intensified. What was often ignored was his strong legal defense, careful avoidance of direct involvement in provable crimes, willingness to serve time without publicly retaliating. In the public imagination, however, legal strategy was less exciting than the idea of secret deals and betrayal. The word rat carried particular weight in this context. It was not just an accusation of cooperation with police. It was a direct attack on Johnson's honor, masculinity, and loyalty to his community. In the code of the streets, being labeled a rat was worse than being labeled a criminal. It implied cowardice and betrayal, making the accusation especially inflammatory when spoken aloud on national television. What made the accusation even more controversial was the lack of direct evidence. No court transcripts, signed statements, or confirmed testimonies ever surfaced proving that Johnson informed on associates. Even federal authorities never publicly identified him as an informant. The label persisted largely because it was repeated, because it was proven, demonstrating how narrative can overpower fact over time. By accusing Bumpy Johnson of being a rat in front of his widow, the TV host was not merely repeating a rumor. He was reviving an unresolved and deeply offensive claim. It challenged Johnson's legacy, questioned his sacrifices, disrespected those who believed he endured prison rather than betray others. That is why the accusation carried such explosive force, turning a tense interview into a moment that television history could not comfortably contain. Bumpy Johnson's widow faced an incredibly difficult position during the 1972 broadcast. Not only was she grieving the loss of her husband, who had passed only a few years earlier in 1968, but she was also suddenly thrust into the harsh glare of live television. The show forced her to confront rumors and accusations that directly challenged the legacy of a man she had loved and supported, placing her in an emotionally vulnerable position with little room to prepare a measured response. She had spent years preserving her husband's memory and protecting the family from sensationalized narratives. In Harlem, where Bumpy Johnson was both feared and respected, the widow carried the weight of community expectations. Many residents saw her as a custodian of his legacy, someone who had lived alongside him and understood the context of his actions better than anyone outside their circle. Her presence on television was therefore laden with tension, as viewers projected their opinions and judgments onto her in real time. During the interview, her initial reactions reportedly ranged from stunned silence to subtle defensiveness. The accusation that her husband was a rat hit not only her personal feelings, but also the collective memory of Johnson in the community. Responding under studio lights and in front of cameras magnified the pressure, as any sign of emotion could be scrutinized, misinterpreted, or used against her. In those moments, she had to balance grief, dignity, and credibility, all while the host pressed forward. The widow's composure contrasted sharply with the host's aggressive style. Observers noted that while she struggled to process the accusation, she maintained a restrained presence, resisting the urge to lash out or openly cry on camera. This restraint highlighted the emotional labor she was performing, navigating personal grief, public perception, and the need to defend her husband's name in real time. Her behavior underscored her understanding of the high stakes, both legally and socially, surrounding the interview. Her reaction also reflected the broader challenges women faced in public spaces during this era. Widows, particularly of controversial or criminal figures, were often treated as proxies for their husbands, with little consideration for their own agency or perspective. Television producers and hosts frequently exploited this dynamic to generate drama, knowing that emotional responses would captivate audiences. For Bumpy Johnson's widow, this meant being positioned as both mourner and defender simultaneously, a nearly impossible task. The immediate impact of her reaction was evident in the studio. Crew members reportedly sensed the shift in energy as the tension escalated. The widow's measured but tense demeanor contrasted with the host's confrontational style, making the atmosphere increasingly uncomfortable for everyone present. This growing tension likely contributed to the producer's decision to cut the broadcast abruptly, acknowledging that the situation had moved beyond what could be safely managed on live television. In the aftermath, her conduct left a lasting impression. While the host's words were remembered as shocking and provocative, the widow's response was noted for its dignity and restraint. She became a symbol of the personal and emotional costs of public accusations, demonstrating the human dimension behind sensationalized headlines. Her ability to maintain composure in the face of such a direct and inflammatory claim highlighted both her strength and the profound emotional toll of defending a loved one's legacy under public scrutiny. The audience present during the 1972 broadcast played a critical role in how the incident unfolded and was perceived. Whether composed of studio attendees or the wider television viewership, they were primed for an engaging discussion about Harlem, Bumpy Johnson, and organized crime. Many expected a nuanced conversation, personal anecdotes, or insight into Johnson's life, but the tone quickly shifted as the host escalated toward the controversial accusation. This sudden change caught viewers off guard and created an immediate sense of tension in the room. In-studio attendees reportedly reacted visibly to the confrontation. Gasps, sudden silence, and subtle movements reflected their shock and discomfort. Some may have been familiar with Johnson's legacy and understood the weight of the accusation, while others were likely unprepared for the intensity of the moment. The audience's reactions contributed to the growing sense of unease, signaling to producers that the situation had reached a tipping point. For viewers at home, the impact was magnified by the live broadcast. Without context or preparation, the accusation that Bumpy Johnson had been a rat appeared sudden and jarring. Families gathered around television sets likely experienced the same shock and tension as those in the studio, amplifying the moment's cultural resonance. television at the time was a powerful medium for shaping public opinion, and such a striking event left an impression far beyond the studio walls. The audience's perception of the widow's response also shaped the broadcast's impact. Many viewers admired her composure and restraint under pressure, contrasting it with the host's aggressive style. This contrast created a moral and emotional tension that made the moment memorable, highlighting the human cost of public accusations and confrontational media. The audience became, in effect, a participant in the drama, responding emotionally to what unfolded rather than passively observing. Audience reactions also reflected the broader societal tensions of the time. In 1972, America was grappling with racial inequality, urban unrest, and distrust in institutions. The accusation against Johnson, a black man who had maintained power and influence despite systemic obstacles, resonated differently across various segments of the audience. For some, it confirmed pre-existing suspicions shaped by media narratives. For others, it felt like an attack on a respected community figure. Producers and crew monitored the audience carefully during the broadcast. Their reactions likely influenced the decision to cut the transmission after 30 seconds. Live television relied on the energy in the studio to guide pacing and tone, and the growing tension, both emotional and ethical, indicated that the situation had escalated beyond the bounds of controlled discussion. The audience's responses thus became an unspoken measure of risk and discomfort. In retrospect, the audience's role was essential to the historical significance of the broadcast. Their visible shock, engagement, and emotional investment underscored the gravity of the moment and amplified its notoriety. The incident was not just a clash between a host and a guest. It was a shared experience that involved everyone watching, helping cement the broadcast as one of the most infamous live television moments of the era. The tension leading up to the abrupt cut of the broadcast in 1972 built gradually, fueled by the interplay between the host, Bumpy, Johnson's widow, and the studio environment. From the start, the conversation carried an undercurrent of unease, as the host's reputation for aggressive questioning put the guest on edge. Small pauses, subtle body language, and careful word choice signaled that both parties were aware of the stakes, creating a mounting sense of anticipation for everyone present. As the discussion progressed, the host began probing deeper into Johnson's alleged connections with law enforcement and his dealings with rival crime figures. Each pointed question increased the emotional weight of the conversation, forcing the widow to navigate between defending her husband and maintaining composure under the intense scrutiny of cameras and a live audience. The tension became palpable, not just as a social or emotional phenomenon, but as a technical challenge for the production team, who had to anticipate the possible outcomes of a confrontation escalating on live television. The audience, both in studio and at home, added another layer to the pressure. Their reactions, ranging from visible shock to quiet anticipation, fed into the energy of the room. In a live broadcast, audience engagement is part of the feedback loop, influencing how the host drives the conversation and how the guest responds. Every gasp, pause, or uneasy shuffle amplified the stakes and made each word heavier, creating a compounding effect that heightened the tension before the climactic accusation. Body language and nonverbal cues became increasingly important as the conversation advanced. The widow's restrained movements and subtle expressions reflected her inner conflict, while the host leaned forward, maintaining control of the narrative and emphasizing provocative points. The visual cues created a silent battle of wills that viewers could interpret as emotionally charged, adding a dramatic intensity that words alone could not convey. The moment of accusation was the culmination of these escalating pressures. When the host called Johnson a rat, the tension reached a breaking point. It was not just the words themselves, but the cumulative buildup, the prolonged questioning, the historical rumors, the audience's charged energy, that made the accusation so explosive. The studio atmosphere reportedly became almost unbearable, signaling to producers that immediate action was necessary. Production staff and camera operators faced a critical decision as the confrontation peaked. Live television offers very little room for error, and the potential for an emotional or physical outburst can put both the guest and the network at risk. The sudden cut of the broadcast reflected a rapid assessment that the situation had escalated beyond manageable limits. This decision, though abrupt, prevented the moment from spiraling further while preserving the dramatic impact that would later define it in television history. In retrospect, the tension leading up to the cut highlights how multiple factors, emotional stakes, audience presence, host strategy, and live production constraints interacted to create an unforgettable moment. It demonstrates that live television is not merely about dialogue, it is about timing, psychology, and perception. The escalation in those critical seconds exemplified the precarious balance between entertainment and respect, leaving a lasting legacy of one of the most intense confrontations in broadcast history. The sudden decision to cut the broadcast in 1972 was a dramatic response to the intensity of the situation unfolding in the studio. Live television in that era had very limited safety mechanisms. Were no substantial delay systems to bleep or remove inflammatory remarks once they were aired. Producers had to make split-second decisions based on the host's behavior, the guest's reactions, and the audience's energy. By the time the accusation against Bumpy Johnson was made, it became clear that continuing the broadcast risked further emotional harm and potential backlash. Crew members reportedly observed a sharp shift in the studio's atmosphere as the widow processed the accusation. Her composure was strained, her responses measured but tense, and subtle visual cues suggested that she was reaching the limits of her emotional endurance. In live production, such nonverbal signals are critical indicators for the control room. When a guest's reactions show significant distress, producers are forced to weigh whether to intervene or allow the broadcast to continue, and in this case, intervention came in the form of an abrupt cut. The technical logistics of cutting a live broadcast required quick coordination. Camera operators, floor directors, and the control room team had to act instantly to switch feeds or terminate transmission. Unlike modern television, which can implement delays of several seconds or more, early 1970s broadcast technology offered very little buffer. The cut was immediate, leaving both in-studio attendees and home viewers with a sense of sudden interruption. which in itself amplified the tension and notoriety of the incident. Legal and ethical considerations likely played a role in the decision as well. Accusing someone, particularly a deceased person, of being a rat could invite defamation concerns, even if the person accused was already gone. The network would have been aware that continuing the broadcast risked potential lawsuits, public outrage, and damage to their reputation. Cutting the feed was a way to mitigate immediate exposure while containing potential fallout. The audience's reaction also influenced the decision. Live audiences react visibly and audibly, and their discomfort or shock can signal that a broadcast is no longer sustainable in its current form. In this case, the palpable tension in the studio, combined with the widow's visible strain, created a scenario in which continuing the program could have resulted in an emotional breakdown or confrontation. The producer's decision to cut the feed reflects the delicate balance of managing live television dynamics while protecting participants. The abrupt end of the broadcast left viewers confused and intrigued. Those watching at home were aware that something significant had occurred, but the lack of closure heightened the mystery and controversy. In a pre-internet era, such incidents were dissected through word of mouth, newspapers, and magazines, giving the moment a life far beyond its few seconds on air. This uncertainty contributed to the broadcast's enduring legacy in television history. In hindsight, Cut demonstrates how quickly live television can escalate beyond control, particularly when dealing with emotionally charged subjects. It shows that even experienced hosts and production teams must navigate the unpredictable interplay of sensitive topics, human emotion, and audience response. The decision preserved the dignity of the guest to some extent, avoided a potentially explosive escalation, and created a legendary moment remembered decades later for its tension and abruptness. The 1972 incident involving Bumpy Johnson's widow had a lasting impact that extended far beyond the brief moments captured on live television. In the years that followed, the broadcast became a reference point for discussions about media ethics, live television risks, the responsibility of hosts when dealing with sensitive topics. Scholars, journalists, and media critics often cited the episode as an example of how confrontation-driven programming could cross the line between entertainment and exploitation. The event also influenced public perception of Bumpy Johnson's legacy. For those unfamiliar with his life, the accusation of being a rat introduced doubt and controversy into an already complicated story. For the Harlem community and people who had known Johnson personally, the broadcast reinforced a sense that the media could misrepresent powerful figures, especially black leaders, without proper context. The incident highlighted how narratives about crime and morality were shaped not only by actions, but also by the way stories were told on television. Television producers and hosts took note of the consequences of crossing ethical boundaries in live programming. The incident illustrated that even well-known and confident hosts could face backlash if they failed to anticipate the emotional and social weight of their questions. In subsequent years, networks became more conscious of the need for delay mechanisms, stricter content oversight, and careful handling of emotionally vulnerable guests. The lessons learned from this broadcast influenced how live interviews were conducted, especially with grieving family members or individuals connected to controversial figures. Culturally, the incident entered the broader conversation about race, crime, and media representation. Bumpy Johnson's identity as a black crime figure complicated mainstream narratives, and the broadcast underscored how public accusations could disproportionately affect minority communities. Historians and cultural commentators have noted that the tension between sensational media coverage and community memory shaped how Johnson's story and the story of Harlem's mid-20th century criminal landscape was remembered in subsequent decades. For media historians, the incident became an enduring case study in live television dynamics. It highlighted the complex interplay between audience expectations, host behavior, guest reactions, and production decisions. The abrupt cut, in particular, became a symbol of both the power and limitations of live broadcasting. It demonstrated that even short, unplanned moments could have an outsized impact on public memory and historical record. The broadcast also influenced the portrayal of crime figures in popular media. Films, television series, and documentaries often reference the tension and controversy surrounding Bumpy Johnson, sometimes drawing inspiration from the 1972 moment. The incident contributed to the mythos surrounding Johnson, blending fact and dramatization, and cemented his status as a larger-than-life figure whose legacy could not be easily simplified or categorized. Finally, the legacy of the incident serves as a reminder of the enduring responsibility that comes with public platforms. The moment is still cited as a cautionary tale for journalists, hosts, and media professionals. Words spoken on live television carry weight, especially when history, grief, and reputation intersect. The combination of live tension, unverified accusations, and human emotion created a singularly powerful episode, one whose impact continues to resonate in discussions about media ethics, public memory, and the complexities of Bumpy Johnson's enduring story.